Welcome to the Behavioral View.
The social validity of the treatments that you're providing being just as important as, and maybe even more important than, social validity indicators that are written about in research, because it's so much more than just asking a person, are you satisfied with what we did?
How do we incorporate that? What do we learn from that? And how should we respond to people that have legitimate issues with the past history of some of the things that we've done to people?
Listening and acknowledging and having a decent human interaction conversation should be warranted. Sometimes these conversations are hard because we're talking about their humanity, where for us, sometimes it is an academic exercise.
And if we're trained to notice and experience those emotions and make room for them, then we can actually do stuff that's intentionally directed at what we really care about in the moment and helping that client. On the other hand, if we're not trained to do that and we're just trying to avoid emotions at all costs, what are we going to do when we start to feel sad when a client feels sad? We're going to do some kind of behavior to make that sadness go away.
Hey everyone, would you like to get a CEU for this episode? Listen closely for the announcement of 3 secret words delivered throughout the episode. Take note of those words and we will tell you where to go to get your CEU when the show is over.
3, 2, 1, go. Happy birthday, Jonathan!
Yeah, thank you very much.
Your birthday.
I did not see that coming. These are really good hats.
I have needed a reason to wear this hat for
we didn't have birthday hats.
But we have a unicorn hat. And what is this other one that Shannon's wearing? This is so cool.
Some sort of reptile.
Okay, some sort of reptile, perhaps a dragon or lizard or something. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you for noticing.
That is a killer hat, Shannon.
I told you I was
impressive.
Yeah.
Great hat, Rick.
Yeah, my colleagues shamed me.
No, you just apparently did not get the slack.
No, I didn't have a hat that was worthy of our good colleague's birthday. So I dyed my hair blonde up here. So does that count for something?
Alex can put one in on your head post production wise, I think. So
That's
I'll take it.
we got you.
Do the Snapchat hat. Anyways, we didn't want to kill you or put our voices on YouTube in perpetuity, so we thought a hat would be appropriate. So happy birthday. Thanks for gracing us with your presence on your birthday. And everyone, welcome to the Behavioral View. Today with us, we have Jonathan Tarbox. As you can tell, it is his birthday. He is the program director of the Master of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis program at the University of Southern California, as well as the director of research at First Steps for Kids. Dr. Tarbox is the past editor-in-chief of the Journal of Behavior Analysis and Practice, a board member of the ABA Task Force to Eradicate Social Injustice, and a member of the advisory board of the Women in Behavior Analysis, WEBA conference. He has published 5 books on applied behavior analysis and autism treatment, in the series editor of the Elsevier book series, Critical Specialties in Treating Autism and Other Behavioral Challenges, and an author of over 90 peer-reviewed journal articles and chapters in scientific texts. His research focuses on behavioral interventions for teaching complex skills to individuals with autism, acceptance and commitment training, ACT, and applications of applied behavior analysis to issues of diversity and social justice. Dr. Tarbox, welcome so much. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I think we're going to have a fun conversation.
For sure, for sure. I have to say, I'm super jazzed of having you here. I I don't know if you remember the first time we met. I remember, I'm sure I was one of the many freshies on your list of people that you interviewed, but it was interview weekend. UNR, it was January 2003.
Wow.
And yeah, let's go back in time. And sitting in Dr. Linda Hayes' lab. And, obviously you being her student there and interviewing in her lab, you were discussing radical behaviorism with me. And that may have been one of the, I wouldn't say the first time I heard that word, but definitely in a serious context. I just at that time started lab with Dr. Pennypacker. Before then, I had a few ABA courses under my belt. Before I applied to behavior analysis, I was going clinical. And so it was like, wait, we're going this way? Oh my goodness. And so I just I felt inside frozen and unsure how to respond. You were so kind and gentle. And I think that you realized that I had no idea how to answer these questions that you're throwing at me, and that you pivoted. And I was like, so you want to talk about extinction? I mean, I don't think that I said that, but that's what's going on, in my head. But I remember being absolutely intimidated, by no means of what you were bringing forth, but just by understanding that I was just so green, and the level of complexity of the topics that you were bringing at me was not where I was at that time. But that was our first meeting, and even in that context, you were compassionate and kind, which is what we're talking about today.
I'm really happy to hear that, because it's really common for grad students, who I was at the time, to not be super compassionate and kind, because as a grad student, you're being attacked by all these private events that are difficult and stressful, and your life is very difficult and stressful, and you kind of feel like you're under threat because you're trying to do a good job and trying to appear smart and everything. And so it's kind of a pressure cooker, and I think really common for grad students to come off as kind of overly critical, or sort of, kind of catch people being bad or whatever kind of behavior.
Especially an interview weekend is why should you come here? So, but no, I remember going, well, I got nothing to say to this. And I think that you picked up on that. And I think that we deviated, but everything after that is blank. So.
Yeah.
So the real question, Jonathan, is did you bring your graphing calculator? Because it seems like Kerri might want to ask you some rough questions today.
And if you want to put me on the spot, you could ask me some standard charting questions that I might have to can we talk about something else?
Amazing. Well, before we launch into the heavy stuff, let's do an easy one. Just do kind of a round robin. I'm curious, what's everybody reading right now?
First secret word,
Jonathan, you want
is
to go first?
relate.
Yeah. So really and this is the topic that we're going to be talking about today is compassion, but I've really been getting more and more interested in the role of compassion in applied behavior analysis. So I've been spending a lot of time reading works on that. A great book is The Science of Compassion by Dennis Turch and Laura Silberstein Turch. And they are ACT researchers and ACT practitioners who also are really focused on compassion. And so it's not written for behavior analysts. It's written for the broader psychology audience. So you got to do some translating. But I found it tremendously useful. And then Kristen Neff, too. I've been reading her research articles and her books and resources. She's a major compassion-focused therapy and self-compassion researcher, actually. So that's been mostly when I've had a spare second to actually read something, which I really appreciate. That's what I've been reading.
Good. Nice. Rick, what about you?
I always have about 3 or 4 books that seem to be going on at the same time. And some are professional related and some are just interesting things that I like. I'm a huge fantasy fan. And right now I'm reading a book called Ready Player 2.
Yes.
Which is a sequel to Ready Player One. So it's some fun reading, which we all need to do. I'm also reading a book that we have a lot of people that are in business, and I've always been fascinated with business. And there's this book out called Working Backwards, and it's about Amazon. And it just by two people who were there from the beginning, and they talk about all of these powerful strategies that they had to make Amazon into the behemoth that it is. And that might seem like an odd title, but certainly seeing how people do business, that's always an interest of mine. And I'm actually going back and I'm reading The Theory of Instruction by Engelman and Carnine. And that book this is going to take me a few months. So, I'll probably have to keep saying that in subsequent episodes because it's a big book and it's dense.
You can give us updates. Yeah. It's awesome. Well, Kerri, what's on your shelf right now?
Well, I have a listening book and I have a reading book. Because when you got three littles that you're running after, you gotta put them in your ears. So I have A Promised Land by Barack Obama. Because that actually brings some solace to my soul. Just hearing his voice is actually, I started it a little bit ago, and it actually is just kind of nurturing to hear him talk. And I started actually this week for my reading book is Stacey Abrams' Our Time Is Now. I'm a few chapters in, and she compares, she ran for governor of Georgia and is really the reason why Georgia turned blue recently. And but she compares the voter suppression during her race in 2018 with the voter suppression throughout the history of our country. So I'm just a few chapters in, because again, downtime with kids, it gets loud at the end of the chapter, but right now it's been a really it's been an awakening book. So it's powerful.
Wow. And coincidentally, this time I'm going to list some highbrow stuff. In the future, you guys are going to hear me talk about true crime. I mean, I'm like Rick. I need a break sometimes. I need some silly, some fun kind of stuff. And true crime is not silly and fun, but there was some of that in there too. So right now, for the fun side, and I am going to mangle her name. I feel terrible about it, but I'm reading Bark Skins by Annie Proulx, I believe is how you pronounce her name. So she just recently had won Pulitzer Prize, and this is not the book she won it for, but I'm reading that one. And work related, I am reading Beyond the DSM, or I should say, I am trying to read Beyond the DSM. Because
it sounds like a real page turner.
It is. It's very invigorating and exciting for a nerd like me. But I teach an undergraduate abnormal psychology class, and I'm always trying to just interject, hey, there's another thing besides the DSM. So that came out perfectly timed for me to start disseminating early before they know anything else. They can start listening to the other side.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So that's what we have going on.
Yeah.
Let me turn to asking you some questions, Jonathan. We have, the topic that we're going to talk about is one that is becoming increasingly focused on in our field, which we'll label compassion-focused ABA. And this is something that you are a leader in and something that we're very eager to hear you talk about it. So let's start off at the very beginning. What does this look like, and how's it different from what else is out there?
Yeah, great. So I actually just want to start with a quote from my wife, Courtney Tarbox, who's a full-time practitioner, also getting some research done too, and a clinical leader. She says, being human just has to be more important than the science. It has to come before the science. That's their
I
exact
love
quote.
that.
That's
Being human
beautiful.
has to come before the science.
Yes.
And so that's right. And so
Yeah.
it's not to say that we need to dilute the science in any way.
No.
We don't need to abandon the science. It's just
By
that
all
we're
means.
human beings first. and we're going to rest our science on top of a foundation of being human first. And so, yeah, what does that look like? I think at the most fundamental level, we approach, so compassion-focused ABA is somewhat like stuff we can do today, and it's somewhat aspirational, like what we're hoping for the future, right? So maybe we'll start with what we're hoping for the future. What I'm hoping for the future is we won't need the term compassion-focused ABA because it just will be ABA. Like all of what we do will be recognized as compassionate, empathetic, and human and nurturing. But to get us there, maybe we start doing things like each moment, each procedure, each protocol, each behavior intervention plan, each session, each intake meeting, each staff meeting, each RBT mentor meeting, we stop, take a deep breath and say, am I conducting myself in a way that tells the other human being sitting across from me that I care about them and that I want to alleviate their suffering? And if the answer is I'm not so sure, then the next question maybe is, I wonder if there's a way that we can do just some small tweak, some small change to our procedure, not really to the function of the procedure, but to the topography of the procedure. Some small change in the way that I interact with the other human across from me that makes that more clear and that puts compassion first.
That's fantastic. I feel like a lot of we talk about assent protocols fall under this umbrella. Would you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Because, first of all, human beings just have the right to assent. That's a basic human right. And even if that wasn't true, like even if we didn't have to give people assent, don't we as humans want the opportunity to assent to things that are done to us? And so, yes, of course, like we care about it. If we're focusing on caring about other humans, alleviating their suffering, then not giving assent is a great way to unintentionally increase someone's suffering, right? Not giving the opportunity to give assent and not assessing assent from the individuals that we work with, from the caregivers, from parents, frankly, from the staff that we supervise. We shouldn't just be doing stuff to our staff. We should be checking in.
Yes.
And from our colleagues at work, we should be checking in. Like, is this okay with you? Is this working with you?
And so what you're talking
about, that is critical.
So it's at all levels of the organization. So not even just the clients. And so for us to model compassion, it starts with the top, right?
I think so.
And if we are compassionate with our colleagues and with our staff and with the people that we supervise, we should then obviously need to be compassionate with our clients. I was watching Good Girls, needed some, downtime over the weekend and watched Good Girls on Netflix. And there was this episode of, she went to a therapist and this therapist was terrible. She wanted to talk about that she witnessed a death. The therapist keeps on talking about, are you wearing lotion? I smell perfume. What are you doing? Right? Not addressing the suffering that she was feeling in that moment. And finally she was like, ugh, and gets up and walks out of the room. Right. So as neurotypical functioning humans, we can do that. My husband pulled my daughter out of a harmful dentist procedure where the dentist wasn't showing compassion to her. We have the right to do that. Why should we not assume that for clients who are neurodiverse, who have autism, who have some form of disability, right? We should extend that same right regardless of neurotype.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there's so many layers to this. One, just at the most fundamental level, and this is going to rub people the wrong way, I think, to some extent, but at the most fundamental level, by definition, if we've identified negative reinforcement as a function for challenging behavior in our clients, that means the client doesn't want to do what we're trying to make them do. Right. And so that right there, just engaging in that problem behavior that has a negative reinforcement function, is telling us that they're not giving us assent. They're not assenting to what we're doing with them. And so that's at the most fundamental level. And maybe that's the only communication strategy that the client has, is a tantrum or aggression or screaming or whatever. That immediately should be a red flag for, I wonder if there's a way that we could re-engineer what we do to not motivate our clients to not want to assent to what we're doing. And how can we consider challenging behavior as a legitimate form of communication, and no, we don't want to go around reinforcing it. Obviously, we're about building skills that will help the person thrive in all settings, right? And also, we could probably do that by really considering assent at the level of the individual client.
Can I ask you to spend a little bit of time talking about this whole concept of suffering? Because I know it's a big deal in ACT, and it's not a word that we use a lot in behavior analysis in general. So
yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So if you look at pretty much all major religious and philosophical traditions, across cultures and across languages and across time, a fundamental piece of being human is suffering. That's the basis of Buddhist philosophy. That's actually the basis of the Adam and Eve story, is that everything was fine until we got knowledge of the world, and now we've been given suffering as human beings. It's at the basis of who we are. To suffer is human. And the reason for that, you don't have to believe that. There's a good reason for it, and we can understand it behavior analytically. It's all about respondent conditioning, that things hurt. There are aversive stimuli in this world, and things get paired with those. And so the stimuli that get directly paired with the primary aversives are themselves going to be aversive. And then because we have complex language that involves transformation of stimulus function, and RFT has a big elaborate explanation of this that works. But the take-home point is the way that we talk about the world, the way that we language the world, brings in the functions into our current environment that aren't there, but we can talk about them. And just talking about them, or we could covertly talk about them, and you can use the word think, that sounds scary. Just thinking about something aversive does indeed functionally bring in the aversive properties of that thing that you're thinking about. So thinking about screwing up a speech, let's say, makes you actually feel anxiety right then when you're thinking about it, even though you're not on a stage. There's nothing there. There's no lion trying to get you, right? But just thinking about it functionally is similar to being out on the savannah with a lion trying to hunt you down. And this process, this ability to this transformation of function, ability in human language evolved because it worked. It was super adaptive when we're out on the savannah trying to cooperate, trying to predict when a lion's trying to get us, trying to find the trees that have the best fruit, and trying to build weapons and structures together to survive in hunter-gatherer groups. Super adaptive in those circumstances. And now we're in this circumstance where really for most of us, no one's trying to kill us. We're not in danger. And yet our language still works the same way. It's still always trying to detect danger, trying to figure out where that lion is that's trying to eat us. And what that does is it just brings in suffering. I mean, every day we're going to experience something aversive that isn't really there. And it's just because of the magic of human language. And so if we try to pretend that's not there, and just focus only on the overt behaviors, well, that's great. And hopefully we'll train up and shape up some really useful, valuable overt behaviors. And at the end of the day, we're whole human beings. That suffering's there. And the research in the ACT literature is pretty clear that the more we try to avoid aversive private events or suffering, the more we try not to feel the suffering, the more we go down the road of escape behaviors and bad habits that just don't help. Drinking too much alcohol, consuming too much social media, getting, too obsessed with some new thing where all the behaviors that we engage in to sort of tamp down or avoid experiencing suffering as human beings, to the extent that we do them too much, they get in the way of living a full and really meaningful life. So it's kind of a joke to pretend that we don't need to pay attention to that.
Right.
Yeah, right. I agree. And I think the reason the word always jumps out at me is so many years of undoing the language of you're suffering from autism, you're suffering from your disability. So getting people to label correctly, I guess, what the suffering is.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what you're talking about is pivoting from a medical model where we assume there's something wrong with you and we got to find the thing broken inside of you to fix it, pivoting from that to a behavioral model where we just assume that no one's broken. No one's broken. Everyone has behavioral repertoire. Some of them are working better. Some of them are working worse. And everyone's suffering. It doesn't matter if you have a diagnosis or a label. You're suffering if you're a human being. You don't get to be a human without suffering. It just doesn't happen. It's a fundamental part of being a human. So I use the word suffering to refer to that, just the inevitable full range of emotions that we have as human beings, including negative aversive ones. Not to refer to some label or some problem that needs to be supposedly fixed by psychology or medicine or some other discipline.
So when you talk about compassion-focused ABA, what about people that say we need to have an emotional detachment so that we can remain clinically objective? Is there validity to that thinking?
No, definitely not. Sorry. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that's wrong. Oh. And you know, if people want to stand by that, do some research, you know, produce some research that shows we get better clinical outcomes when we don't share any of the emotional experiences that our clients have. They could do that research. That we could do that. We could have a, you know, one condition where clinicians are trained really well on empathizing and engaging in compassion with their clients. And we could have another condition where they're not, where they're clinicians who are trained to avoid any emotional experiences. We could test that out. I'd be willing to do that research in a heartbeat. But the fact is, you know, we already have guidelines about professional relationships. We already have guidelines about multiple relationships. We already have guidelines about not letting your own issues sort of influence what you're doing with the clients. So just because that we notice how our clients feel, and we might even feel it sometimes, doesn't mean that suddenly we can't do what's in their best interest. It's just us experiencing emotions on the job is just another part of our environment in which we work. And if we're trained to notice and experience those emotions and make room for them, then we can actually do stuff that's intentionally directed at what we really care about in the moment and helping that client. On the other hand, if we're not trained to do that and we're just trying to avoid emotions at all costs, what are we going to do when we start to feel sad when a client feels sad? We're going to do some kind of behavior to make that sadness go away. And I can almost guarantee you that behavior to make us not feel is not going to be received well by the parent, right? So what does that look like? Exactly. That looks like just changing the topic when the parent expresses that they're upset. Or it looks like, well, we got to just focus on the protocol. Or it looks like, well, my research says blah, 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 blah. Or my ethical guidelines say I'm not allowed to accept a glass of water from you. And, you know what I mean? So like experiencing our emotions, I think actually empowers us to be more professional and more effective when those show up.
And I would say, you know, there's a list of, while it's not in our research, but Taylor, LeBlanc, and Nozick have a list of articles in other disciplines where they say bringing in compassion led to better outcomes in the medical field and in the mental health field. And and also common sense people. Do you know what I mean? Do we need the research to even, I mean, yes, great. Glad that we checked that box. But also, you know, there's so many instances that we can even talk about within our own family and our own experiences where we can say, when this nurse did this with my grandmother when they were in the hospital, or when this caregiver spent this extra time, like we saw them get better. We see the data, we see the outcomes, or the commitment to the treatment plan, or, you know, they started taking their pills more regularly, or, I mean, these are steps towards better outcomes, because you gave a damn, you know. And if we can just take that extra step and become human with these families, and it's not an artificial relationship, it's actually a caring, empathetic one, then that's when you know that, you know, the parents, they know that they can trust you. And then that's when you have the honesty and the relationship to build from, and you're able to get the outcomes, not for just the outcome's sake, but it's just everyone's in it together.
I totally agree. And I think we have the functions of behavior on our side when we take a compassionate approach. Because when you think about it, when we're trying to get other people to change their behavior, if the main reason why they're doing it is to avoid our disapproval, or avoid our nagging, or avoid our prompting, then we're establishing a negative reinforcement or escape avoidance function for their behavior change. is that really the function that we want to help people establish?
No, that's
Is that
gross.
they should be engaging in healthy behaviors out of avoidance?
No, that's
I don't think so.
Ugh.
Yeah.
And it sets that behavior change up for failure when we leave. Because if the main reason why the parent is playing ball is to avoid our disapproval, when we're gone, what do you think
It's
is
not
going to
going to
happen?
maintain. Yeah, that's not going to maintain
Right.
at all because we're gone. There goes the aversive stimulus, right?
That's right. That's right. We just talked about that in a webinar that I was a part of on the social validity of the treatments that you're providing being just as important as, and maybe even more important than social validity indicators that are written about in research, because it's so much more than just asking a person, are you satisfied with what we did? They're always going to say yes. No one is going to look at you and say, I didn't like what you did. Get out of get out of here, right? So, I mean, I guess I have so many questions running through my mind as you talk. I'm bouncing a little bit. I want to bounce back for just a second because you talked about training. So one thought that I had in my mind is, what does training for that look like? I know what it looked like for me because I was trained outside of behavior analysis. But the other question is it more than training people to be compassionate? Are we training them to be not compassionate? Do we need to undo some training that we're already doing?
Yeah. And so I think Rick's kind of getting at that a little bit with his question too, that, I mean, there is maybe a tradition of us being maybe a little overly rigid, maybe coming off as a little bit arrogant sometimes, maybe thinking our way is the best way and that stuff, and maybe just sort of, caring so much about the data and the protocol and the procedures that we almost put that on an altar and worship that above and beyond other aspects of the human interaction. And that is modeled. I mean, it was modeled for me in a lot of ways. I had amazing mentors. I'm so lucky. And also they're a product of their environment, and so, I think a lot of the sort of lack of compassionate approach has been modeled for us. And to the extent that we continue to do what was modeled for us, now we're modeling it for the next generation. And so what we have really focused on doing in our graduate program at USC is from the very first, from day one, showing up as whole, vulnerable, authentic humans as professors and owning it when we get something wrong. Labeling, like briefly tacting our emotions, not to make the teaching interaction with the students about our emotions. It's not like that, but just acknowledging that those emotions show up. And so, for example, if, a student asks a question about social justice, let's say about maybe an African-American person being killed at the hands of the police, I might in that moment say, wow, I feel like so much rage right now. I actually am not sure what to say. Like I feel really, really angry. And just doing that, just creating just a couple moments to label the emotion and model not trying to avoid it. Just make room for it. And now let's move on and do something productive in terms of overt behavior. And so let's have a discussion. Let's design a research protocol. Let's do something. I'll give you another example. A student once in class asked about the Commit and Act organization in Sierra Leone and their work when the Ebola outbreak was happening there. And they came up with this incredible intervention to honor people who have died from Ebola without physically touching them. And so they came up with this idea of use the trunk of a banana tree and wrap it in banana leaves and act as though that's your loved one who passed away. And so you can place your hands on the banana tree and you can say a few last words to your loved one. Whereas the traditional cultural tradition there was to actually touch the loved one. But if they died from Ebola, then they're going to give it to you. And so this local organization there figured out this new intervention, and they used ACT actually in the matrix to create it. But when my graduate student asked me about this, in the moment, I was like, I realized when I'm going to answer this in front of the whole class, like, I think I might tear up a little bit. Like, this is serious stuff. Like, I can imagine, what if it was my kid, because there's like some of the banana trees were only about 3 feet long, they're kids, they're kids that died. And so I had a choice. Like, I could change the topic or say, I don't remember, we could talk about something else, or I could do my best to tell, answer the student's question in front of everybody, even if I might tear up a little bit. And I said, like, God, I'm crying right now. Like I'm having the thought that professors aren't supposed to tear up in class, and also this is serious stuff. Like, this is like maybe the most important stuff. This is what brings us to this field, is to make a difference for other humans. So just showing up with that vulnerability, I think models one of the most important processes in compassion-focused ABA, which is the willingness to be imperfect. In the ACT literature, it's talked about as the acceptance or willingness repertoire. So I think that's one place we can start.
And it's such a relief too to not have to be perfect, right?
Yeah, it's a gift to yourself. Yeah,
absolutely it is.
and it's a gift to the. No, you go ahead.
No, please continue your thought.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a gift to those you're interacting with too, because when you model imperfection, you're showing them that it's safe for them to be imperfect. It's safe for them to be the real them, not some fake version that they're trying to project. And I tell you what, if we're not wasting effort trying to be something we're not and trying to pretend, if we're able to just focus on what we care about and then focus on a behavior that moves us in that direction, we're going to be more effective anyways. So like being willing to make mistakes and be imperfect probably actually makes you more perfect.
Yeah, that's, I think, refreshing to hear. And, it's also refreshing to hear, to like tact into those emotions for yourself and to like allow space for others' emotions and their suffering. Too often do I see some of the rigid behavior analysts question the suffering.
Sure.
By saying like, because I wouldn't have suffered in that situation, I don't think what you went through is traumatic, or I don't think what you feel is suffering. And that's, I personally just struggle with that. And I'm not sure how to get around that. Because if we don't give any like credit to the person that we're interacting with and believing, that they're engaging in actual suffering, then it's going to be hard for us to then work through that interaction. So how are we able to like get over that hump?
Yeah, I think it's such a good point, and I really think that the relational frame theory literature on perspective taking, and frankly, the theory of mind literature from outside of behavior analysis, gives us a great clue, and that is just actively practice the behavior of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes. So not what do I think they should be thinking, or actually, acknowledge that. Like I actually think that you should be thinking something different. So notice that thought,
Sure.
And then don't be done. Then say. And what would I think if I were you? Like, how would it be different if I was over there looking over this way back at me? And just, and it's not a mental thing. It's a behavioral thing. You got to practice it over and over across multiple exemplars until you're fluent at it.
I think that is a wonderful tip. What's running through my mind right now is it's not just behavior analysts who struggle with this. I think anything that's outside of our own experience, especially if it's really big. So I get pulled into a lot of consults on cases for kids who just are off the chart on the adverse childhood events scales, and it's the same thing over and over and over again, the same profile. Like you can almost see that it's going to be in their background when you see the paperwork, right? With the list of, they've got ODD, they've got ADHD, they've got bipolar disorder, they're on 3 meds, and their IQ is between 70 and 85. And once we get into the story behind that child, and it will be the people who are struggling with that child behaviorally who are telling this story, and they know everything that has gone through. And still, there's this belief that when the behavioral problems occur, we must come down with the hammer, or it's going to be forever and ever. This is the way they interact with the world. And they skip through that empathic piece.
Yeah, and also just skipping through having philosophic doubt, which is supposedly one of our basic philosophical assumptions, and just being skeptical. Like, maybe I don't have it right. Maybe there is a different way to do this. Maybe we don't need to come down with a hammer. Maybe there's a more compassionate way that we can do behavior management that will still work. And maybe it's worth testing that with some data, and let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, fine, we can go back to the more traditional way. But trying to put that empathizing and compassion first.
So do we have research already? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, as I just said, do we already have some research on this?
Yeah, well, actually, I want to talk about a study that my wife did on kind approaches to extinction, and she's just about to submit it for publication. And I'm so inspired by this. What she did was basically just say, I wonder if we could just be a little nicer to kids while we implement extinction. And you know, and this came out of us having our own child who needed some extinction. She had some pretty intense tantrums when she was really young, and we thought, okay, yeah, just don't pay attention to it, don't give her what she wants, And then we both are looking at each other like, what the hell are we doing, man? She's suffering. She's really upset. Like, yeah, it's an operant tantrum, and she's genuinely sad and upset. And we both looked at each other and said, I wonder if we could just be really nice to her while we do it, And so let's say it was tangible extinction. We'd actually pick her up and hold her and say, I'm so sorry. I know you're so frustrated right now, and we just can't give it to you. I'm really sorry about that. I love you. And give her a kiss. And she would still cry for a while, and she'd have the extinction situation, and and it worked. And the behavior went down, and we felt really good about ourselves. And she could see from us that we genuinely were trying to care for her in that moment, even while we weren't willing to give her the reinforcer for the problem behavior. And so my wife, Courtney, then did it across, I think, 5 clients at First Steps for Kids, and universally saw really rapid, really effective extinction effects for challenging behavior, all the while being nice. And actually, we were giving preferred consequences contingent on problem behavior, but just not the functional ones. Right. So if the function was tangible, we just give lots of attention and like nurturing and petting their hair and holding them and stuff. If the function was escape, we'd say like, oh, I know you're so sick of this. This is boring. Huh? I'm really sorry. And we still got to get it done, and then present the next demand. And it was beautiful. It worked as well as any extinction we've ever done. And the parents looked at it and go, wow, like you care about my kids while you're doing that. That is really cool.
What did you do
I actually just happened. Go ahead. That just happened last night.
Kerri, this is the last time I'm going to do that. I'm not going to ask the next question. I'm going to let you do it. But I'm just curious, what did you do when the function was attention?
We didn't have any kids in that initial program evaluation that had attention functions. So I'm not totally sure what that would look like, but we hypothesized something like, oh man, I know you need my attention right now so badly. I'm so sorry. I just can't pay attention to you right now. Give them a hug and then ignore them. And maybe even, we just have to test this, right? We get some data. If they continue to tantrum, maybe even every few minutes, check back in and go, I'm really sorry. I have to keep ignoring you. And then go back to attention extinction. Is that a little bit of intermittent reinforcement? It might be, right? But you know how we'll know? Data. And if the data shows the tantrums persist, then fine, we do something different. We do traditional extinction. But if the data shows the tantrums go down, maybe that's a better way to go.
Yeah, I was just say that last night, my son unfortunately lost his tablet, and and he came and snuggled with mom. So we don't need to be these sterile robots. That's not why we got into this field. That's not why we do these things. And
if you look at the research, there's no studies showing that cold extinction works better than kind extinction.
No, and it actually produces more severe problems during that time that
could.
Yeah, that you have to mitigate or deal with during that outburst. And this actually kind of takes us to another topic we wanted to talk about is some critics. We have a community that we interact with and that we serve, and whether the autistic community has received ABA services or not, there is a portion that is not super big fans. And but yet this notion of compassion seems to be relevant here, that there is a lot of things that we say, and in my time communicating with members of this community, there's actually a lot that we agree with. We agree that RBTs need more than 40 hours of training. We agree that, that some of these procedures, like we just talked about, need to be revamped and looked at with compassion. Like there's a lot of these things that we actually do agree upon, and there's some that we don't, but just listening and acknowledging and having a decent human interaction conversation should be warranted. Sometimes these conversations are hard because we're talking about their humanity, where for us, sometimes it's an academic exercise. And so how, you and I, we did a project together, this listening pledge about listening to autistics, and, that was scripted, but what are your personal feelings about listening to the autistic community in general?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's a really complex topic and question, and so I don't want to oversimplify it with a brief answer. But first and foremost, I think it's really, really valuable that the autistic community is finding their voice in public, and that this is happening, that there's an opportunity for the autistic community to speak out and stand up for themselves and really self-advocate. I mean, I think that is necessary for all groups of humans. And there's no reason why neurodiverse humans should be any different. They have as much right to stand up for themselves and communicate their perspectives as any other group of humans on the planet. And while they're doing that, if we as a profession interface with that community a lot, even maybe a slightly, some people say, well, a lot of the neurodiversity folks, like they already had enough skills and language where they didn't even need ABA or whatever. That's possible, right? And also, if they identify as part of that community, it's our duty to listen. It's our duty to at least listen. And we've already learned about this from the DEI work that we're all doing now with racial justice. The first thing we need to do if we're the people in positions of power is just shut up and listen.
Yeah.
Shut up and listen. That's the start. That's the beginning. Be quiet and just listen. Notice where it hurts. Open up to, wow, I'm feeling enraged right now. And I'm going to shut up and listen. Wow, I'm feeling really insulted. And I'm going to shut up and listen. So I think that's the first step. And then, if we want to do better, we got to use these opportunities as a context for self-reflection and self-improvement. We are so lucky to have Professor Ibram Kendi as a guest speaker at USC a few days ago. And what he said was, when someone criticizes you or gives you feedback, let's say, on issues related to racial justice, let's say, it's actually an act of love because they're giving you an opportunity to notice and do better and to grow as a human being. It's when people stop giving you feedback, that's when you better start to worry.
That's a really good point. So many of my interactions or so many of my listening opportunities, and yes, Facebook is a battlefield. People come in hot, but I also in my listening phase have learned to discriminate between some people's hotness and this is them educating, and the tone, and if you're able to weed through the temper, if you're able to put your lens aside and say oh, I'm reading this as them being hot, as opposed to wow, there's actually a lot of really good information here. And they just spelled out to me how I can do this in a more compassionate, non-confrontational way with this learner that I have about this one thing, or they're telling me about what a meltdown is like for them when they go through this, or how they feel with all these sensory overloads. They just gave me so much amazing information in there. That is a blessing. That is a gift to me. And I would have never have had that information had I not been just put that, that any sort of bias aside about how you should be interacting with me in some sort of presupposed way, and just looked at that gift and saying yeah, you did school me. And I needed that. I needed all that information right there.
Yeah, I want to share a brief story. A friend of mine who's an adult with autism, who's doing great, has a fiance, has a job, has a house, all this stuff. He's an awesome guy. he shared with me that when he was a kid and he got a top quality ABA program, what was considered top quality back then, whatever that was, almost 30 years ago now.
Right.
He shared with me that, as he got older and started to have the verbal behavior to sort of reflect on stuff, he noticed like it seemed like his BCBA, which they weren't even BCBAs back then, but the behavior analyst in charge, it seemed to him like the supervisor was kind of mad at him all the time. And he shared that with me. And I thought, oh my God, wait a minute. That's not who we want to be. No, there's no way that that's who we need to be.
Right.
There's no way that that's who we need to be, that we need to act in a way to where our clients would authentically perceive us being kind of dissatisfied and angry and grouchy with them all the time. There's no way. And if we just engage in some perspective taking and say, what would it be like for me if an authority figure in my presence always seemed like they were dissatisfied and grouchy with me or mad at me, even when I was trying really hard during one of the most difficult times in my life? What would that be like for me? Would I go back to that teacher? Would I go back to that doctor? Would I be happy with that police officer's behavior? Right? Obviously not. So why is it any different just because this little child with autism doesn't have the words to tell us, you're making me feel upset, or you're making me feel scared, or did I do something wrong? Why are you talking to me like that? Like, are you mad at me? Like, if a kid could tell us those words, we would be acting differently.
Mm-hmm. The second secret word is delight.
All right. I feel like I don't want to ask another question because I'm going to like talk over somebody.
I know. I'm being careful now too. Like the long pause in between now. Well, okay. We did put out on Facebook a call for questions from others. And I guess if we want to talk about the other side of this topic, the question was, how do we continue to promote a better understanding of ABA in the world and show that we can be compassionate and, to get the message out that there is such a thing as compassionate ABA?
Well, we can't convince people if we're not doing it. It's got to be real first, right? And so we better start doing it. We better start enacting this more on a day-to-day basis in our practices. And I love that article by Bridget Taylor and Linda LeBlanc and Melissa Nozick, because it actually outlines, what is it? I think 33 or so behaviors. They say, look, here's the behaviors. Get your clinicians to do these behaviors. See if you can measure them, check them off. Here's a staff training checklist. And so that's a great resource. Like, why are we not doing that in all of our ABA agencies? At least review that checklist of behaviors during staff trainings, during staff meetings, and say, how are we doing on these? Like, could we do any better? Here's an opportunity for role play. Let's talk about it. Let's role play it. Let's give each other feedback. Behavioral skills training, right? And let's practice until we do it rapidly and accurately with fluency. I think that's the first thing we got to do. And then, more things like this, like we got to talk about it. And I think ultimately we need to own where we're not perfect. We need to own that we have a ways to go, like every profession does. We're not uniquely uncompassionate or something. Every profession could do better. And why would we want to be the ones kicking and dragging our feet? Perhaps we could be the leaders. What if we were the most compassionate field that worked with people with autism? Could we be that? What would that be like for us? Would we have to sacrifice our science? I don't think we would.
No, I think our science is sophisticated. This is a synopsis of a quote from Michael Fabrizio, who did a lot of work in the Cent 20 years ago. Precision teachers have been doing this for a while, but it's saying like our science is sophisticated and eloquent enough that we should be able to find a different way to do this, to get to the same end result, right? He said it a lot better than that, but it's something like that, right? And the thing is that, like if we do the work, and this is what I keep on hearing, from my neurodiverse friends, is saying like, if we do the work, then that's what matters. And it's not necessarily just, the protesting or the performance stuff. It's saying like, you do the work at the high level. We make this change at the structural level of our field, and they see that these agencies across the board are, implementing, compassionate, focused ABA. They're making the changes where harm is no longer, occurring. We're not seeing these complaints that are trickling down towards the licensure boards. I sat on one for 2 years. I know that degree. It's that these changes and procedures are happening at the highest level. And that's when we know it's happening. It's not where we give a very basic assent webinar and people are going, huh? Wait. So I give in. I say yes. I say yes, you can stop. Right? That question doesn't happen anymore, right? So when those things start happening, then that's when trust is built.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's about approaching compassion as a fundamental property of what we do, as a starting point for what we do. If I, could be so bold, I would say it needs to be one of the defining dimensions of applied behavior analysis. Maybe it's the 8th characteristic or whatever. It needs to be on equal ground with everything else. And I think Mont Wolf with social validity was trying to get at that, and it didn't quite describe it as that. It's not the same thing, right? But it gets to that same idea that we need to care about where our clients are coming from and what their input is, and consistently throughout. We could consider something like, every single behavior intervention plan. We should ask ourselves the question, are we thinking about client assent? Are we assessing client assent? We could ask ourselves the question, is my behavior likely perceived as caring and nurturing by the child with autism? Is my behavior likely perceived as compassionate by the parents or the teachers that we're training? Just asking the question, not a judgmental black and white yes or no thing, just a point of reflection. And that's an opportunity to make small changes.
Well, right now we're going to have to give everybody who fell on the floor when you suggested that there is something that could be added to something that is classic literature.
Get a cab. we gotta figure out where that compassion goes with get a cab.
Yeah, we're going to have to find another letter because I don't know whether we can do that in the anagram. But I guess that you're kind of used to answering questions along those lines as an ACT guy, huh?
Definitely.
You mentioned Wolf. Let's go back to our founding fathers. I feel as if, or let me ask you, do you think that they had compassion in their mind when they wrote about behavior analysis?
Definitely. And I've only been doing this for 23 years, so I wasn't there personally to actually get to interact with much of those folks, which I regret. But my mentors were their mentees and also their colleagues to a large extent. And so I feel like I'm not that far away from inheriting some of their influence. And definitely, so Pat Fryman talks a lot about this, that Montrose Wolf said something like, there's enough aversiveness out there in the world. I don't need to contribute anymore. If someone wants their behavior controlled through aversive control, they can go to someone else. That doesn't need to be me. And he was about shaping other people's behavior with kindness and compassion. Murray Sidman talked about how even though he made one of the most important discoveries in the history of our science, stimulus equivalence, what he cared the most about it was helping a young man learn how to read. Like, what an incredible gift to give someone to be able to read with comprehension, And he talked about the aesthetics of it and the relationship that he had built with Cosmo, the first research participant to demonstrate stimulus equivalence. He had a picture of Cosmo with Cosmo's arm around his waist, like he trusted him enough, even though he's a researcher. He wasn't even his practitioner, as far as I know, but he trusted him enough that he actually wanted to have physical contact with him during research sessions. I think that says a lot. If you look at Skinner's early writings, all of his writings, they were about building a future for humanity that's more based on positive reinforcement, less aversive control. What could be more compassionate than eliminating aversive control? I mean, essentially, that's, one of the major definitions of compassion is engaging in action that's oriented at alleviating others' suffering. So what causes suffering? Aversive stimulation. I mean, that's like functionally what that is. And so eliminating aversive control to the greatest extent is one of the greatest things we can do to be compassionate. So I absolutely think that the roots and the foundation of this were there at the very beginning of our field. I don't know, Rick, maybe you might know the answer to this, but I've heard a myth or a legend or something that Skinner only did one experiment on shock, and he felt bad because he could see the rat was like in pain, and the poor rat's paws got shocked and he was in pain, and he never did another study on punishment again. So I don't know if that's true, but even if it's like an estimation, it gets at like what Skinner was about. And I do feel like we've carried that forward. We have a long ways to go, but I feel like it's for sure been in our foundation from the beginning.
So what else has been in our foundation is we've had a dark history also in terms of how we have treated individuals. And it's difficult because some people who will criticize ABA and they're angry, and they'll take things that were written, they'll talk about experiments, and how do we incorporate that? What do we learn from that? And how should we respond to people that have legitimate issues with the past history of some of the things that we've done to people?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that question. And I feel like it's time to stop ignoring our past and just kind of come to terms with it and acknowledge it so that we can actually move forward. And so, yeah, I think the first step is to respond to those critics with compassion and with a genuine attempt to understand why they think what they do and what I would feel if I was standing in their shoes. Because, let's not forget, like our whole science is based on the idea that the learner is always right or the organism is always right. So does that count for everybody except for our critics? Like suddenly they're not they're not learners that are right anymore because they're critics of ours? Of course not, right? Their behavior and their understanding is shaped by their history and their current circumstances. And so we need to do our best to understand those. And I think fundamentally, we've got to acknowledge that we haven't been perfect, and use that as an opportunity to move forward. Even the most over the top statement, for example, there's these like the Lovas and Reckers article on punishment based procedures for getting people to behave in more gender conforming ways, which is total shame and stain on our history. Even that, let's say a critic says Lovas and Reckers, conversion therapy, therefore all ABA is abuse. Of course, we're not going to agree with that statement. It's way overgeneralization, right? You could take an abusive article from any other profession and say, here's an abusive article, therefore that whole profession is abuse. All medicine is abuse. All psychology is abuse. All teachers are abusive. Of course, that's an overgeneralization and an oversimplification. And when we contact that, when we see that on Facebook, that still, even then, is an opportunity to say, I wonder where that person's coming from. Like, how are they so upset and feel so harmed that they want to make our whole field into villains because of one article? What conditions would lead to that? Like, what learning experience would lead to them thinking our whole profession is a bunch of villains? Use that as an opportunity. And we don't have to agree with that. We don't have to say, yeah, you're right, we're all abusers. We can say, why would that person think that? What can we do? Is there anything that we're doing right now that some people might misinterpret as abusive? And is there anything more we can do in the future that would decrease the probability of us experiencing or receiving what we do and how we talk as abusive or uncaring? Mm-hmm. It's just, let's face it. We're in the position of power here. No one's taking away our ability to practice. Like, it's the same thing with the racial justice work. When we get criticized for missteps with racial equity and racial justice, it's not like suddenly all the white people are not going to have jobs anymore. Like, what are we afraid of? We're so lucky to be so privileged and so powerful. The same is true when we're criticized from the neurodiversity movement. We have this incredible profession. We have insurance funding in every state. It's not going to all disappear. And actually, if we behave defensively, we probably will help it get harmed more than if we show up with humility and take a deep breath and say, what can we learn and how can we do better?
The third secret word is reflect.
Some of the criticism, especially about the article that you mentioned, is that, part of it is the protection of that article and how it's not being retracted. I think that that's a bit of the criticism that's coming along the lines, and that is a bit debated right now. But especially since some of the practices that are occurring in our society have referred to that article to continue some of those practices, as those practices are not outlawed in all states.
Yeah. So-called conversion therapy, which is abusive,
Exactly.
is actually still legal, right? In many states. And that's
But not
really
all,
a
right.
travesty.
Not everywhere. Yeah.
But not everywhere.
And it's hard to say. I'm not going to judge what another journal is doing. Like, I'm not in their shoes. I don't know what they're coming from and all of the contingencies they're dealing with. My basic understanding, though, of the publishing, ethical publishing guidelines that we have to follow in our journals is that if research is unethical, then it's okay to retract it. And it doesn't say in those guidelines unethical by the standards of the day that it was published. It just says unethical. And so my understanding, and again, I am not in the shoes of the people at the head of the job. I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying, you asked me the questions. I'll say, from my understanding, if it was an article in BAP, for which I just finished being the editor, my understanding would be it's okay to retract it. If by today's standards, it's clearly unethical, that will put a permanent mark next to that article or on that article. It won't hide it. It won't disappear. It'll still be in print forever. And it'll say retracted. And here's why, because it's unethical. To me, that seems like a reasonable way to go on that. But again, I'm not in the shoes of the people making those decisions.
Sure.
Yeah.
So shifting a bit of direction here, we have a bit of, we've talking about a bit of disagreement about how we use compassion in our field and stuff like that. How are we able to use compassion? Like, so what are some strategies, you're the ACT guy. Are we able to use some of these ACT strategies in bringing about compassion? Because, social media is hot and, we want to work in alliance with our fellow behavior analysts. How can we do that with colleagues, with our learners, with ourselves? What are some strategies here?
Great question. Thank you for that. And it's interesting because my sort of career trajectory, before I discovered ABA and autism, I was in political science as an undergrad, studying nonviolent and compassionate community building. So that was like what I was going to do, was try to make the world a better place through building compassion in communities. And then I met a kid with autism and I discovered ABA, And so I thought that my career totally took a different path. And then it wasn't until I started engaging the ACT work more that I realized, oh, no, this is right in the middle of behavior analysis, or at least it needs to be, and it can be. And the ACT work was really super helpful with that. And compassion is a big piece of the ACT work. It's mostly, it's throughout, especially in values, but it's also in the self as context piece. And all of that means is like being more flexible with how we respond to ourselves as stimuli, and creating more flexibility around perspective taking, which necessarily involves putting ourselves in other people's shoes and seeing how other people see us, and then seeing how they see us, see them, right? Back and forth. And just a natural consequence of that is feeling the feelings that the other person has. You experience their emotions a little bit more when you imagine what it would be like to be them. That's a natural part of transformation of stimulus functions in human language. There's nothing bad or good about it. That's just how human behavior works. And so when we do that, we start to notice, wow, we have so much in common, like so much in common. There's so much that unites us. I'm glad that you mentioned Obama, because I feel like that was so central to his message, that what we have in common is so much greater and so much more important than what we have in difference between each other. And so the ACT work just puts you right in that. And the more you engage that work, you actually kind of can't ignore it. And then you check in on what your values are. And if your values are making the world a better place, creating connection with other humans, nurturing human beings, like compassion, it's right in front of you, and it's so obvious, and it's just a natural breeding ground for compassion. And then the committed action part is about asking yourself, no BS, like, what am I willing to do here? Am I willing to actually do a behavior on the outside? Like, it's one thing to say I care about compassion. Am I willing to do something different this Monday morning that I didn't do last Monday, because it's going to lead me towards a future that I care about more? And then when that's really hard, the acceptance work or the willingness work teaches you skills for staying present even when it's really hard. So if having compassion, showing compassion for a parent who maybe you're at odds with, maybe that necessarily involves you experiencing the feeling of frustration or experiencing the thought of this parent hates me, or experiencing the thought of this parent doesn't even appreciate it. They don't get it, right? All of these thoughts and feelings that show up as part of being a whole human being, the acceptance work helps build our willingness to do it. It's the behavior of moving towards stuff that hurts a little bit, like keeping your hand in the ice water a little bit longer, so that then you can be present and do that one behavior that's going to transform your interaction with that person in that moment. So I found it just incredibly helpful. And I'm not an innovator here. I mean, there's, again, people like Evelyn Gould and Lisa Coyne and Dennis Turch and Laura Silberstein-Turch and Kelly Wilson's a huge one on compassion and self-compassion. So there's a ton of work in the ACT literature that's really, really valuable for behavior analysts to become, to strengthen our compassion skills.
So in our field, we're transitioning to talking more about ACT. We have people that ascribe to a certain way of thinking. For example, you can have inner behaviorists, you can have radical behaviorists, and you can have methodological behaviorists. So we have a group of people that have a hard time talking about accepting thoughts and feelings as things that we should be dealing with. So, how are we going to reach out to that camp? And I have some colleagues that will say, well, ACT is just a bunch of cognitive mumbo jumbo. They'll just dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah. Well,
so where's the? It's a hard thing to talk about because when you have people who are ingrained in a way of thinking, and I don't know how many people that would represent in our field, but that's certainly a challenge even in our own group.
For sure. And, and I think I'm old enough now to where I was part of that group or am part of that group. So even though I got my PhD at UNR where ACT was created and invented, honestly, my first initial thoughts were that's kind of cognitive BS. I mean, that was my initial impression, honestly. And then really it was just through exposure. Just read the books, read the articles, read the material, and then actually practice some of the stuff. And then it's like obvious. Oh yeah, this works. Here's a really easy choice. Do I want to live a life where my thoughts and feelings are really challenging and get in the way and I get stuck? I say stuff to my wife that I don't mean because my feeling of, frustration is so intense or something. And I actually believe that when I feel this way, I have to act that way. Do I want to live a life where I'm getting pushed around by thoughts and feelings? Or do I want to live a life where I notice thoughts and feelings as just more stuff in my environment? They're not special. They're not, causal constructs. They're just more stuff that happens. Notice that stuff, pivot towards the sources of positive reinforcement that I really care about, values, and then pick something and just do it. And then notice that, wow, my behavior loosens up and becomes more flexible. I'm more responsive to my environment. I'm actually more attuned to the consequences. So I can try something and see if it works. If it doesn't work, fine, leave it out, forget it. If it does work, though, maybe it's worth changing my behavior a little bit. The choice is obvious. I mean, being rigid and stuck is not a fun way to live. Being flexible and values-oriented is awesome. It makes every aspect of life better. Even suffering. It makes even suffering much more livable. So that's the general approach. But also, frankly, maybe this is going to sound a little snobby, but man, you better read some radical behaviorism. Skinner was cool with this stuff in 1945. You can find all over the place in Skinner's writings talking about how private events functioned as SDs, as reinforcers, as punishers, as rules, as private MOs. You didn't use that word, but basically that's what he meant. That's all over the place in Skinner's writing. That's it. That's all that ACT is. There isn't any new stuff added on. It's just a whole set of treatment procedures that treats private events like that. And a little bit more sophisticated analysis of rules and rule following and stuff like that. But philosophically, it's 100% consistent with Skinnerian operant psychology. So I just don't think there's a problem. I mean, if you think that mentalism and cognitivism is in the word that you use to describe a procedure, then maybe you'd have a problem with it. But if you understand that mentalism and cognitivism is a philosophical issue, it's where you use invented constructs to explain behavior. If you know that, then just read one book on ACT. The first couple chapters are on behavioral principles. And it's immediately clear that we're not inventing constructs to explain behavior. We're using behavioral principles actually to explain behavior. And man, if you look up an ACT book on Amazon, it suggests what other books you might want to buy. You'll see a whole bunch of books on behavioral principles. What does that tell you? That tells you that people who buy ACT books are also buying books on behavioral principles. What that's telling me is the ACT work is actually an evangelist for behavior analysis to get outside of our little community and out into the broader worlds of psychology and just humanity. So I'm not worried about it. I think those grouchy folks, if they give it a shot and they just like take a sip, I think that they would be pleased with the consequences of that lever press. And if not, that's okay too. Like, it works to just stick with your stuff that you're doing that works, if it works for you.
Well, you know what? We started with books, and I kind of want to end with books, if that's okay, because you have listed a lot of authors out there. If you were going to tell a behavior analyst who was interested in both sides of that, how am I going to use ACT a little bit with my clients? How am I going to use ACT on myself to be more compassionate? Give us 2 books to start with, if you don't mind.
Oh man, there's too many. I can't just say 2. Let me start with a really valuable self-help book that's really useful for people that work in autism. And it's called The Reality Slap by Russ Harris. And I think it costs like $15. It's it's really affordable. And Russ Harris is a really accomplished ACT trainer I think he's a psychiatrist in Australia or something, but really accomplished ACT trainer who also happened to have a child diagnosed with autism. Total coincidence. But he uses that experience to walk the reader through applying the ACT principles and procedures to your own life. And it's extremely powerful and really easy to understand. So I would suggest anyone who wants to just like have their behavior work better in their daily life, read that book and actually try the exercises. Don't just read them and think about them. Actually practice it. Even when it feels kind of touchy-feely and weird, just give it a shot. Worst case scenario, it doesn't land for you and you never have to do it again, right? But press that lever, see what happens. So do that book. That's a great book on sort of self-help. A really great book to read that's a little bit more technical is called Learning Relational Frame Theory. It's actually called Learning RFT by Niklas Törnicke. He's a Swedish psychiatrist or psychologist, I forget. It's written actually for clinical psychologists. So it's actually easy to read and it's not like just hitting you over the head with jargon. It makes sense. There you go. Kerri's got it. Yeah. The first part of the book, the first half of the book, is a perfect introduction to RFT, which it's not written for behavior analysts, but it makes sense. It works. It talks about behavioral principles. The second part of the book is an application of that to working with more clinical populations. And so that's where it gets more active, but it really gives you like a good foundation. And then Tom Sabo is under contract right now with Context Press. He's writing what will be the first manual on ACT for ABA practitioners. That's going to be a really, really valuable book, like literally just a how-to manual of how to do ACT in your ABA practice. And then I'll also plug a recent article that I published with Tom Sabo and Megan Acklin on what the heck did we call it? Acceptance and commitment training within the scope of practice of applied behavior analysis. And it was published in the journal Behavior Analysis and Practice as part of the special issue on acceptance and commitment training. And in that article, we go through all of like Beowulf and Risley, 1968, and critique ACT according to that. And then we go through the Behavior Analyst Certification Board task list and talk about ACT and how it fits in with that. And then we go through all of the hexaflex, the 6 components of ACT, and we do a behavioral conceptual analysis in terms of behavioral principles and nothing else of what's going on with the entire hexaflex. And then we talk a bit about scope of practice and scope of competence. But that's a good article to kind of show really clearly in jargon and language that behavior analysts will recognize and understand. This is behavior analytic. It always has been behavior analytic. It was just packaged for a general clinical audience, but it's always been based on a behavior analytic understanding of complex human behavior.
Awesome. And one thing to to reinforce your comment about Russ Harris, he has also the Happiness Trap workshop as well, which I hear is fantastic.
And so many resources. If people just Google Russ Harris PDF or Russ Harris worksheets or whatever, there's like hundreds of really useful resources for free.
Yeah, for sure. So
I do find that ACT, I'm sorry. I just wanted to give them a pat on the back. I do find that ACT does a fantastic job on the dissemination side. You guys make it so easy, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sure.
Well, and I'm not going to take credit for that. I mean, it's really the contextual behavior science community, which includes behavior analysts and psychologists, and also a lot of other folks, medical doctors, nurses, speech therapists, physical therapists, people from all walks of life, using the ACT work to supercharge whatever they're doing in their profession and just make it work better to get better behavior change. Have just done a great job of making that work accessible and make it make sense to as broad swath of humanity as possible. So it's really valuable.
It's a model for sure.
So, Jonathan, you, as we mentioned, are the director of the Master Program of Applied Behavior Analysis at USC, and we want to give you an opportunity to talk about the great stuff that you guys have going on. I know that you guys are starting to offer some CEUs through your program. There's opportunities for scholarships at your program. Can you dive in and tell us more about that and other amazing things that you've been up to?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So we created the master's program in ABA at USC about 5 years ago. And the reason why we did it was we looked around and we saw the proliferation of sort of like high volume master's programs that are trying to train as many people as possible, which I really appreciate. The world needs more behavior analysts. There's no question about it. And also there is, I think we all acknowledge, a problem with quality in our field, and that we need to do a better job of doing quality assurance and really just training people to the highest degree possible. So we created this program at USC to be a small program where we only take as many students as we can really give thorough, good quality mentorship and really good quality supervision to. And our goal, the mission of the program, is to set the standard for this is the highest quality graduate training in behavior analysis you can get. And that sounds really arrogant. I'm not saying we're the best, but I'm saying that is our goal. That's the purpose of our program, is to give you the best training you can possibly get. And we do that on a foundation of values that we've had identified from the very beginning. And those values include the obvious stuff like science, dedication to science, and excellence. But they also include less obvious stuff. Like from the beginning, we've been dedicated to diversity and social justice. And so we see that a part of the mission of our program is to make the world a more equitable and just place, one little bit at a time. Yeah. International dissemination is another value of ours, that science does not belong to upper middle class white people. Science belongs to humanity. It's a gift to humanity. And so, the vast majority of millions of people around the world, if they have a child with autism tomorrow, they're not getting an ABA program because there aren't enough resources. And so we really work on international dissemination. One of the main tools that we use for all of this is the ACT work and the RFT work. And so all of the students that come through our program get really intensive training directly from me and the other faculty on how to do ACT inside ABA. And so really all of our students, when they're done with our 2-year program, can actually do some of it in their day-to-day jobs, which is really exciting. Some of them turn into trainers, ACT trainers, which is really exciting and really interesting. So newer developments, of course, USC is a private school, so it doesn't get subsidies from taxes for tuition. So tuition tends to be pretty expensive. Yeah. To some extent, private nonprofit universities, you get what you pay for. I mean, you get a lot more support, a lot more networking, things like that. So it is more expensive. So we've really been working on fundraising for our scholarships. And so we do a variety of things with that. In fact, a lot of times when I do a speaking gig, I'll have some donation or whatever as part of that. The new thing we're developing is a continuing education series focused on diversity and equity, and where we invite experts from the field to do a panel discussion or a symposium over Zoom, and all the proceeds that go to that go directly to our student scholarship fund. And so I don't get paid a penny. The cool thing is USC doesn't get paid a penny. There is zero overhead that's charged by the university. Like literally, if you donate $1 to that scholarship, literally $1 comes off of tuition for a graduate student in ABA. So we're really excited about that. We've done one event so far. We're going to keep rolling with that every few months. It's, we don't really have the time to do anything new. We're kind of too busy, but we're really excited about that initiative.
That's fantastic. And if somebody wanted to donate on their own to the program, how would they go about that?
Yeah, thank you for that. So we should have a link on our website. How do we not have a link on our website? Obviously, right?
Well,
I'll fix that.
How about by the time of this airing, you have a link on your website?
Yeah, I better. Okay, yes. So go to our website and you'll see a link that says donate now to the Student Scholarship Fund. But even if you didn't see that, you could Google give to USC, and then there's a big donation website, and you click I want to donate to a specific program. And I think if you just type in the word like behavior or applied behavior analysis or something, it'll be really easy to find. It's the USC Applied Behavior Analysis Scholarship Fund.
Fantastic.
I'm sure we have some ability to give people that information, so we'll figure out how to include that with this episode too.
Excellent. I appreciate that.
Yeah,
sure. All right. Well, that is about all that we have time for today. Jonathan, Dr. Tarbox, thank you so much for your time and for taking us to church, essentially, today. This was really just a powerful conversation. I feel just invigorated, and I hope that our listeners do too. I feel like there was a lot of gold nuggets. I always say that I like to hear gold nuggets from a talk that are actionable items that you can just take away and implement immediately. And I think that you gave quite a few of them to us, many of them to us today from this conversation. So thank you for that. And with that, we will see you all next time. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks for watching this episode of The Behavioral View. To get your CEU, follow the link in the instructions below. You can then go to the attendance verification quiz, where you'll enter in the secret words and pay the CEU fee to generate your certificate. You've already done the work, you may as well get the credit.